What would you do if an entire lecture hall fell silent just because you dared to correct a professor in front of the academic board? A quiet black student sat among hundreds of skeptical stares. Everyone had already decided he was going to fail. But just minutes later, he became the one who made the entire system fall silent. And the most shocking part, the student they expected to eliminate, ended up being the one who forced the entire board to rethink everything they thought they knew. Do you believe intelligence has a color? Drop your thoughts in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe for stories that go straight to the truth. They never said it out loud, but everyone was waiting for him to fail. A black student in a worn-out hoodie sat quietly under the cold morning light of Armitage Hall, completely out of place in a room thick with scholarship legacies, IQ scores, and pedigreed surnames. Elijah Rowe had no mentor, no guiding hand into the world of academia, and not a single person in that hall believed he belonged. From the front row, Professor Rowena Blake stepped onto the platform like she was walking into battle, not to teach, but to eliminate. It was a special lecture, stacked with heavyweights like Jasper Holloway, the veteran professor whose eyes scanned students like X-rays searching for weaknesses. The tension was razor sharp. They never said Elijah's name, but every gaze landed on him, as if the candidate to be cut had already been chosen. And Elijah kept his head down. He didn't respond, but he remembered the time he gave a correct answer in his previous class, only for the professor to hit delete in front of everyone. The day he applied for a teaching assistantship and was told, "This scholarship isn't meant for someone like you." The night at the library when he helped a classmate fix their solution, then overheard them say, "If you're that smart, why didn't you get into MIT?" Each of those cuts built into a storm. Elijah didn't come today to protest. He came to make them witness what they never thought possible. If an entire system misjudged you, would you stay silent or rise and make them fall silent instead? Would you walk into that classroom and teach the very people who once tried to erase you? Rowena Blake was never one to quietly observe. She preferred to judge. That morning's special lecture at Armitage Hall wasn't about sharing knowledge. It was a staged trial, a public evaluation meant to send one message loud and clear. Only those deemed truly worthy would be allowed to remain in her class. And among the unspoken names already marked for elimination, Elijah Rowe had always sat at the top of that invisible list. Distinguished professors like Jasper Holloway were in attendance. No one had come to learn. They came to witness who would fall first. Rowena entered like a judge entering court, her eyes sweeping across the room, but paused the moment they hit the center row. Elijah didn't lower his gaze, not out of arrogance, but because he had been underestimated so many times. The weight of contempt had long lost its sting. Still inside him, something festered quietly. Last year, he submitted a research proposal for the honors term, only to receive a single-line rejection, skill level incompatible with academic standard. He didn't argue, just tore his draft into pieces before anyone could see the dream he'd poured an entire summer into. And that's why this morning was no longer just another lecture. It had become a final trial at the heart of prejudice. When Rowena began writing the first equation, a convoluted string of Laplace transforms, the room fell completely silent. But by the third line, Elijah frowned. A small error, barely noticeable, but if left untouched, it would invalidate everything that followed. And when Elijah raised his hand, it was as if the air itself held its breath. No one corrected Rowena Blake in front of the board. No one ever walked away unscathed after doing so. But Elijah wasn't trying to walk away anymore. He wanted to see it through, to either fail with dignity or force them to never look down on him again. And his hand, still raised, didn't tremble. Alongside visiting professors like Jasper Holloway, no one needed to say it out loud to make it clear. Elijah didn't belong there. To them, this wasn't a classroom. It was a battleground. And Elijah was the pre-selected loser, brought in to prove why he should be cut. But sometimes all it takes is a single line, a single incorrect transformation in Rowena's Laplace equation to shift everything. Elijah didn't raise his hand to stand out. He simply couldn't watch knowledge be misused, even if it came from someone like Professor Rowena Blake. The air in Armitage Hall thickened as he rose to his feet. His voice wasn't loud, but it was clear, and it was right. "Professor, there's an error in the third step." The entire hall froze. Rowena turned, slowly. Her eyes didn't just look at Elijah. They cut through him, like a single glance might erase him entirely. But Elijah didn't flinch. He repeated himself, not as a student pointing out a mistake, but as a mathematician addressing a problem. That shift in tone changed the entire room. "If you're so sure," Rowena said with a crooked smile, "then come fix it for me." An invitation, but everyone knew it was a trap, and Elijah knew it too. No one had ever corrected Rowena Blake in front of the board and kept their seat. But instead of retreating, Elijah walked forward. Each stroke of chalk wasn't just about fixing the math. It was etching into that blackboard the years he'd been denied. A guest professor whispered, "What does he think he's doing?" But when Elijah finished the final step, Rowena turned away, without a word, because any word would have been too much. And when the room finally shifted, when eyes moved from Elijah to the board, he knew he had done the impossible. He made the system fall silent. When Elijah spotted the error in the lecture, he didn't just correct an equation, he rewrote the way the entire system had seen him. And the moment he set down that final piece of chalk, the room stopped being a battleground. It became a place that had no choice but to witness the truth. Rowena Blake stood in silence. For the first time, the sharpness in her gaze wasn't directed at her students. It turned inward. A professor who had never tolerated being questioned now stood face to face with something she couldn't deny. She was wrong, and the one who corrected her was the student she had always tried to push out. There's something oddly powerful about seeing someone in control, caught off guard. One of the guest professors placed a hand over his chest, not out of admiration, but because he realized something. The silence in the room was no longer about fearing Rowena Blake. It was about recognition, something that had never happened inside Armitage Hall. Rowena turned slowly. Her eyes scanned the room and stopped at Elijah's seat. She spoke, not with anger, not with pause, but with words sharpened by a pride that had just been wounded. "Talent has no color." No one applauded, but students sat up straighter. A few lowered their heads, not in shame, but because they had just witnessed something more memorable than any lecture. And Elijah? He quietly returned to his seat, opened his notebook, and kept writing, as if nothing had happened. No triumphant smile, no defiant glare. Because for Elijah, he didn't need their approval. He just needed them to stop underestimating him. And that alone was enough to change not just this room, but every room after. Rowena Blake didn't lift her head when Elijah set the chalk down. Not because she didn't see the solution, but because she couldn't find a single flaw in it. A student they all dismissed had just corrected her, right in front of the entire faculty. And what left her speechless wasn't the accuracy of his answer. It was Elijah's composure. No triumphant grin, no defiant glare. Just silence. The kind of silence that speaks louder than any retaliation. Out in the halls of Northmore Institute, whispers spread like wildfire. An unknown contender had outshone a delegate from MIT with a cleaner solution, a simpler method, and above all, something no sample answer had ever achieved. It moved people. Rowena exited the hall like someone who had just lost a chess match she believed she'd rigged down to the final move. But some games aren't in the hands of those who set the traps. They belong to those who dare to make the move no one else will, even when they know it could cost them everything. A week later, at the first lecture following the event, Rowena stood at the podium, just like always. But this time, her gaze lingered a little longer on Elijah. She didn't speak loudly, and she didn't speak long. "I won't repeat myself," she said, "but I'll say this once. Talent has no color, and true intelligence doesn't need protection." Elijah sat where he always did, calm, focused, ordinary. Only now the person who once looked down on him could no longer find the words to deny him. Elijah had corrected the error flawlessly, and in that moment, the atmosphere inside Armitage Hall flipped. The so-called silent authority of Rowena Blake had been stripped. Not by words, but by strokes of chalk so precise they left no room for doubt. Every eye, from Jasper Holloway to the most senior professors, turned to the board. But this time, they weren't searching for a mistake. They were searching for a way to deny what had just happened. They didn't want to believe it, that a student whose name they hadn't even bothered to remember had just silenced the entire academic machine. When Elijah took one step back and placed the chalk gently in its tray, the sound was soft, yet it hit like a hammer to the pride of an entire faculty. Rowena didn't speak. She only pressed her lips together. But her eyes said everything. "No way," a student whispered. "He actually did it." The classroom wasn't holding its breath for Elijah to fail anymore. They were waiting for Rowena's response, and she didn't disappoint. She turned, wiped the board clean. Quick, sharp. Then, without missing a beat, began writing a new problem. More complex. A maze of symbols, nested functions, time-sensitive variables, and a pace twice as fast. A few students exchanged glances, shaking their heads. They knew exactly what was happening. Rowena wasn't teaching anymore. She was retaliating. "If you think you're that capable," she said, her hand still moving, "then solve this." It was a blow, smoother than any insult, because now if Elijah failed, everything he'd just done would be dismissed as luck. But Elijah didn't sit down. He looked at the board, took a breath, and stepped forward, without a flicker of hesitation. Not because he was certain he'd win, but because he'd rather fail in front of a difficult equation than live forever beneath the gaze of people who never really saw him. Refusing to back down, Rowena Blake stepped away from the board, then turned and continued writing. But this time, it wasn't a test of skill. It was a strike, a mathematical labyrinth twice as complex. Nested integrals wrapped inside derivatives. Laplace transforms layered over Fourier equations. This wasn't a problem meant for students, not for the faint of heart, and certainly not for someone who had just dared to correct her. A female student seated near the front frowned. "This one doesn't even have a sample solution, does it?" Jasper Holloway, the visiting professor, smirked slightly. "If he's really as brilliant as they think, now's the time to prove it." Elijah stared at the board. He didn't speak, but his hand reached for the chalk. Not because he was sure he could solve it, but because he refused to back down just because others assumed he couldn't. A brief pause. Then the chalk moved. The first line appeared. Clean, concise, correct. No flourish, no attempt to impress. He wasn't performing. He was simply being honest with the one thing that had never doubted him: math. Rowena stood with arms crossed, her gaze cold as steel, but beneath the surface a current stirred. He should have walked away. A male student leaned toward his friend. "If he makes even one mistake, she's going to destroy him." But Elijah kept writing, step by step, not fast, not slow, deliberate. Surrounded by harsh stares and hushed ridicule, he was building a bridge of logic between two worlds, one built on prejudice and one grounded in truth. And with every stroke of chalk, Elijah moved closer to something no one believed could be real. All of Armitage Hall held its breath. Elijah Rowe didn't just solve the labyrinth Rowena Blake had deliberately crafted, he unraveled it so seamlessly even the most arrogant minds in the room were left stunned. Every line of chalk was an answer to every doubt. Every calculation was a blow to prejudice. No hesitation, no erasures, no glances for help. And then, as Elijah set the chalk down, the air seemed to freeze. A student whispered, eyes wide, "He didn't miss a single step." Jasper Holloway, who had smirked just minutes earlier, now squinted, searching for a mistake that didn't exist. Rowena stood still, arms crossed, but deep in her eyes something stirred, an undeniable, simmering quake. "If I don't break him now, there won't be another chance." Then she spoke, for the first time, stripped of her usual arrogance. "Well done, Rowe. But if you're truly that exceptional, then prove it, on a national stage." The hall rippled in shock. She had just challenged Elijah to represent them at the National Mathematics Invitational at Northmore Institute, where prodigies from MIT, Stanford, Caltech collide, where a single misstep can end everything. Someone let out a short laugh. A new game, a fresh trap, an opportunity, or a snare. Elijah looked back at the board, then up at the row of professors, and in that cold, cutting silence, he answered without a flicker of doubt, "I'll do it." The room fell silent, as if the very air had just been stripped away. Rowena Blake, the woman who once ruled Armitage Hall with unquestioned authority, stood motionless, her posture cold, but her eyes betrayed a flash of fury barely held beneath the surface. She couldn't believe what had just unfolded. Elijah Rowe, the student long dismissed as just a diversity admit, had just forced an entire board of scholars into stunned, unbroken silence. Unwilling to let her authority be buried in that moment, Rowena fired back one final blow, her tone more verdict than challenge. "If you think you're truly gifted, then prove it at Northmore Institute, in front of the entire nation." Chairs shifted slightly. A few students tensed. Some stifled nervous laughs. Northmore wasn't a stage for the lucky. It was a battleground for the sharpest minds in America. And Elijah knew it. This wasn't just a math problem. This was the final strike from a system that had always wanted him on the outside looking in. He looked at Rowena. No fear, no pride, just a quiet calm, so deep it was almost unnerving. "I'll go," he said. And his voice wasn't just a reply, it was a declaration. But only Elijah knew what it cost him to say those words. He had just turned down a different scholarship, an easier way out. Because some victories can't be borrowed. They have to be earned, right on the soil that once tried to bury you. From the moment he accepted the challenge, Elijah Rowe transformed the dusty old basement of the Southbridge Library into his personal war room. No air conditioning, no Wi-Fi, just a whiteboard, a dried-out marker, and eyes that refused to tire. Day after day, he tackled problems like every equation was a step across forbidden ground. Sweat soaked through his shirt, sometimes blood traced from his fingertips, worn raw from hours of nonstop writing. But he never stopped. Only one person showed up every night. Milo Thatcher, his roommate, and the first to believe Elijah was more than just a diversity statistic. "How many more nights are you going to stay up?" Milo asked softly, setting down a takeout box, worry in his eyes. Elijah smiled faintly. "Until they stop calling me lucky." Once, Milo told their advisor he'd found Elijah asleep on the floor, his head resting against his backpack, hands still gripping a compass like it was a lifeline. Elijah wasn't grinding to prove anything to Rowena or to Griffin. He was proving it to himself, that his intellect was real, and it was enough. In a quiet corner of Armitage, no one noticed that in the stillness, someone was preparing to step into an arena where the weak don't survive. And the only thing Elijah carried with him was a belief no one else had ever offered him. Even after Elijah accepted the challenge, Rowena Blake didn't let up. For 3 relentless weeks leading up to the competition, she flooded him with problems no undergraduate had any business attempting. High-order calculus equations, nonlinear analytical systems, even conjectures still being debated in academic journals. "If he's truly gifted," she whispered in the faculty lounge, "let him fall at a threshold even PhDs fear to cross." But Elijah didn't fall. One Tuesday morning, in their advanced math seminar, she hurled a famous legacy equation onto the board, one that had sparked 4 years of heated debate between 2 tenured professors. The room froze. Everyone knew this wasn't a test anymore. It was her final blockade. Elijah rose. No notes, no laptop, just a piece of chalk in his hand. He stepped to the board and began sketching a mind map, unfolding the problem step by step, then doubling back to test Rowena's original hypothesis against it. He didn't just solve the problem, he streamlined it. He shaved 2 entire steps off the known approach and opened a new pathway no one had considered. The class was still, no movement, only the dry, deliberate scratch of Elijah's chalk slicing through silence. And for the first time, Rowena Blake, the same professor who once called him a concession of the system, was the one forced to nod in acknowledgement. In front of everyone, Elijah returned to his seat. No words, no smirk of victory. He simply opened his notebook and kept writing, as if a war hadn't just been quietly won. Solstice Auditorium, once a stage for the greatest minds to clash in brilliance, was no longer about prestige that day. It became the place where fairness was redefined. Across the competition table sat Griffin Hart, MIT's golden boy, dubbed the platinum brain of a new academic era. He smirked confidently as Elijah walked onto the stage. No laptop, no team, not a single nod of support from any professor in the crowd. All Elijah carried was a worn-down wooden pencil and a crumpled notebook, the same one he used to scribble equations on city buses after his night shifts. The first question rang out, a multi-layered theoretical puzzle hiding a subtle logical flaw. Griffin punched at his calculator, glanced at his watch. Elijah just stared at the prompt, then lowered his pencil. The air tightened. When the judges announced the result, Elijah wasn't just correct. He had solved it using a method nearly twice as fast as the time allotted. But that wasn't what stunned the auditorium into silence. Griffin, the same man who once sneered, "There's no place in this system for someone who walks in off the curb," stood up, walked across the stage, and reached out his hand to Elijah, in front of hundreds of cameras and the entire Northmore board. It was the moment the system didn't just bow, it learned what respect truly looked like. Elijah said nothing. He simply nodded, tucked his notebook under his arm, and walked off stage. On the stage of Solstice Auditorium, the countdown clock ticked like it was pressing down on the nerves of every soul in the room. All eyes were fixed on two men, Griffin, embodying the face of traditional academia, and Elijah, the one once deemed unfit to even set foot in this space. The question set filled the screens. 3 massive panels covered in dense equations. Griffin frowned, adjusted his strategy, fingers flying over the keyboard, sweat now visible beneath his collar. Elijah, in contrast, sat upright, his eyes calm, his hands steady as he scribbled solutions in pencil on the sideboard. The first 3 questions Elijah solved in a third of the allotted time. The final question, designed to eliminate those outside the system, became his turning point. He didn't just find the answer. He found it using an entirely different method, condensing 10 steps into 3. The judges exchanged glances in silence. Griffin froze. The once praised prodigy now stood uncertain in the very spotlight that had once been his. One of the judges removed his glasses, slowly stood, and began to clap. The applause spread, hesitant at first, scattered, then rising like a wave. No one cheered. No one had to explain. Everyone understood. Elijah didn't celebrate. He simply bowed his head, tore off his final scrap of working paper, and laid it gently on the table. As he stepped off the platform, he glanced toward Rowena. No anger, no triumph. Just a gaze, quiet, almost tender, as if to say, I never needed to win. I just needed to be seen. The final question rang out like a bell signaling the last trial, a high-level, nonlinear equation, the kind that even PhD candidates take hours to unravel just to find the entry point. Inside Solstice Auditorium, the room seemed to hold its breath. Time left, 7 minutes. Griffin hunched over his desk, face tight with tension, scribbling furiously and erasing just as fast. Even the judges exchanged uneasy glances, none of them entirely confident in the solution. But Elijah was different. He looked up at the screen, never once reaching for a computer, just a single pencil, and a silence so complete it was almost unnerving. Each stroke flowed like instinct, no panic, no hesitation, only precision, only clarity. As he penned the final line, Elijah calmly folded the paper and slid it across the table to the judges. Almost 2 full minutes still remained. He set his pencil down, leaned back slightly in his chair, his gaze searching for nothing, asking for nothing. Griffin was still tangled in nested functions and abstract variables. One of the professors stood, walked slowly to Elijah's board, and froze. The solution wasn't just correct. It was so optimized that the current simulation software hadn't even updated to include that method yet. No one spoke. Not out of doubt, but because they had just witnessed something that eclipsed every expectation of the system itself. A young black man, once pushed to the margins, had just accomplished what the field never saw coming. One of the judges gave a slow, deliberate nod. Elijah didn't need to say a word. The answer was already written. Elijah didn't celebrate. He didn't smile in victory. He simply sat in silence, hands clasped on the desk, while the judges slowly rose, one by one, staring at the thin sheet of paper before them as if it were a map out of a maze they'd been trapped in for years. One of the professors, the same man who once ridiculed Elijah back in Armitage Hall, quietly set down his pen, turned to his colleagues and murmured, "This approach, it's shockingly simple and entirely new." In the audience, Rowena Blake sat with her back straight, as always, but the icy sharpness in her eyes had vanished. No one could tell what passed through her mind in that moment: acceptance, or the silent effort to swallow it whole. Griffin Hart bowed his head, not out of shame, but in recognition. He finally understood. He had never truly crossed the edge of limitation, and Elijah, the one everyone had underestimated, had just redrawn the line for an entire generation. In that moment, there were no titles needed, no trophies, no stage lights. Only one thing remained: the truth, plain, undeniable, and irreversible. And when a first-year student in the back row stood and clapped, not as a gesture, not as a trend, the room followed, rising slowly, deliberately, not because Elijah sought recognition, but because they had no choice but to rise, in the presence of what could no longer be denied. The name Elijah Rowe echoed through Solstice Auditorium like a silent earthquake. Then the applause erupted, not scripted, not ceremonial, but raw and real. Yet Elijah didn't rise right away. He closed his eyes for a moment, as if replaying the long nights alone in empty classrooms. The doors slammed shut in his face simply because his name didn't carry the right pedigree. Griffin Hart, the MIT frontrunner, once the brightest candidate in the room, approached him, offering a handshake. Gone was the arrogance. All that remained was respect. Rowena Blake stood a few paces back. She said nothing, but it was her, the one who had mocked him, challenged him, underestimated him, who nodded first. Somewhere in the crowd, a professor who once struck Elijah's name off a nomination list stepped toward the exit, where reporters waited. But Elijah didn't follow. Instead, he walked quietly down the aisle, past the students who once whispered behind his back, and returned to his seat, opened his notebook, and kept writing. Not because he didn't care about glory, but because he never did this to beat anyone. He did it because he knew he deserved to be heard. That victory didn't need a title. Because the truest kind of victory is when those who doubted you can't find a single word left to say. And if one day you find yourself in a room where every gaze sees you as less than what you are, will you stay silent? Or will you rise like Elijah and make the world recalibrate how it sees you? When the host announced Elijah Rowe as the final winner of the Northmore Institute competition, the entire auditorium rose, not just to applaud, but to witness something that had never happened before in the event's history. Rowena Blake, veteran professor, the very one who once vowed to weed out the unqualified, stood up, took the microphone, and said nothing. Not because she had nothing to say, but because no words could shield the weight of the prejudice she'd once defended. Elijah didn't look at her. He looked toward the front row, where students who once ignored his presence now sat crying, as if they had just witnessed something sacred. He wasn't holding a golden trophy. What he held was far more powerful: the right to be present, fully, wholly, and undeniably, as someone who belonged. Cameras flashed. The press surged to capture every angle. But the most powerful image wasn't the perfect score or the unprecedented speed of his solutions. It was Rowena's eyes, falling, for the first time, without pride, without excuses. Only the quiet weight of acceptance. She had been wrong. Elijah stepped off the stage with the same quiet grace as always, as if there had never been a victory to claim. But from that moment on, no one could ever again call him the one who didn't belong. And if one day the very person who once extinguished your dreams has to rise and fall silent before the truth, will you have the courage to make that moment happen with nothing more than your brilliance and your refusal to let the world define your worth. The next morning, sunlight poured through the tall windows of Armitage Hall, landing directly on the whiteboard where Elijah once stood, as if even the room itself was exhaling, finally, after everything. Rowena Blake entered the classroom. No lesson plans, no proud posture, just a woman standing before students who had once been silent spectators to injustice. She took a deep breath, then spoke. Talent has no color, and arrogance is not intelligence. The room didn't erupt, but every glance had shifted. Students who once looked away from Elijah now nodded toward him. Not because he had won, but because they could no longer ignore the quiet presence of someone simply living up to his ability. No one clapped, but everyone listened, and the final image was simple. Elijah, still seated in the back row, same worn notebook, same chipped pencil, but for the first time, his presence wasn't overshadowed. He wrote down the lecture in silence, as if there had been no triumph. But that very calm was the final blow that made the entire system bow, not through force, but through undeniable worth. Elijah didn't celebrate. He didn't rise to accept a trophy. He didn't bow in gratitude. And he didn't look toward Rowena Blake, who had just given the quietest nod of her life. Instead, he reached into his backpack, pulled out his worn notebook, opened to a blank page, and calmly began writing a formula no one had yet touched. No grand declaration, but in that simple, steady gesture, he delivered the most powerful statement of all. You don't need validation to have value, and you don't need to raise your voice for truth to be heard. Under the gaze of hundreds of students, professors, and even those who once denied his worth, Elijah did what few ever have. He forced a system to change, not with rage, but with quiet precision. From that day on, the halls of Armitage no longer echoed with whispers of bias. Only one question lingered, quietly but insistently within every mind. If one day you're dismissed, not because you're wrong, but because you're different, will you stay silent? Or will you rise and make them lower their gaze, not with defiance, but with undeniable truth? If you've ever been underestimated, ever been shut out because you didn't fit the mold, share your story in the comments. And if you believe that brilliance knows no color, no privilege, join us. Subscribe now and be part of the stories that are reshaping how we see the world. There are victories that need no applause, and people who don't need recognition to create real change. Elijah Rowe was one of them, a quiet black student who walked into Armitage Hall under a storm of doubt and prejudice, and walked out not with a trophy, but with a truth no one could deny. Elijah's story wasn't just a math competition. It was the journey of someone who dared to stand when an entire system hoped he'd stay silent, who dared to correct a mistake in front of a classroom waiting for him to fail, and, perhaps most powerfully, who dared to stay silent at the very moment when his victory was undeniable, letting the truth speak for itself. From Elijah, we learn that true worth doesn't need to be shouted. It's shown, quietly, consistently, over time. We also learn this. Prejudice doesn't break apart by accident. It crumbles when someone has the courage to walk into a space where no one thinks they belong, and chooses to be fully themselves anyway, even if they stand alone. If you've ever been underestimated, boxed in because of your skin, your background, or how you live, remember you don't have to wait for someone to hand you an opportunity. Make your own door, because maybe, just like Elijah, you won't just walk through it. You'll open it for an entire generation to follow.